There's an engine that powered Britain's nuclear bombers, an engine so capable that the United States paid to copy it, an engine that by almost every technical measure matched or outperformed its most famous rival. And almost nobody remembers it. The Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire, built in Coventry, England, flying by 1952, gone by 1960. Not because it failed, not because it embarrassed anyone, not because a single pilot filed a complaint about what it did under his wings. It disappeared because of a meeting in a government office, because of politics, because of the way institutional power works when money and prestige are on the table. And that story, the real story behind this engine, is one of the most quietly devastating chapters in British engineering history. This isn't just about jet engines, it's about what happens when something genuinely excellent gets in the way of something more powerful. And it's a pattern you've seen your whole life, even if you never saw it playing out 30,000 feet above you. Let's go back to Coventry. Just after the Second World War, Britain is rebuilding, exhausted, proud, and absolutely determined to lead the world into the jet age. The Americans are pushing hard. The Soviets are moving fast. And Britain, despite everything the war had taken from it, still had some of the finest engineering minds on the planet. Armstrong Siddeley Motors is operating out of Coventry, and here is the first thing that surprises most people. This company wasn't only building engines for aircraft, they were building luxury cars. Elegant, refined motor cars for people who wanted something serious without needing to advertise it. The Armstrong Siddeley car range of that era, beautifully finished, walnut and leather, discreet and precise, was a vehicle for people who had genuinely arrived. And from the same engineering culture, the same workshops, the same obsession with doing things properly, the company was simultaneously developing one of the most advanced jet engines Britain had ever attempted. That contrast tells you everything about what Armstrong Siddeley was. This was not a company that cut corners. This was not a company that shipped something before it was ready. The same minds that applied themselves to a refined luxury saloon applied themselves to a military turbojet with exactly the same standard. If it was worth building, it was worth building correctly. That belief produced something remarkable. But here's what nobody tells you at the start of this story. Being remarkable is never enough on its own. The Sapphire was about to discover that truth in the hardest possible way. Before we get to what happened to it, you need to understand what this engine actually was, what it could do, why the people who worked with it trusted it. Because once you understand that, what comes next lands completely differently. And what comes next is more revealing than most people expect. The Sapphire was an axial flow turbojet. If that term means nothing to you, here is what it means in plain language. Instead of spinning air through a single large centrifugal wheel the way earlier jet engines worked, an axial flow design compresses air through a series of precisely shaped rotating stages, one after another. Like a sophisticated, extraordinarily fast tunnel of controlled force. The Sapphire used 13 of those stages, 13 carefully engineered steps of compression before the fuel even ignited. The result was airflow that was smoother, more controlled, and more efficient at altitude than many of its contemporaries. And altitude mattered enormously in the 1950s. The entire strategic calculation of that era, the bombers, the interceptors, the cold logic of the Cold War revolved around who could fly higher, faster, and further. An engine that performed cleanly at extreme altitude wasn't a refinement. It was the difference between a mission completed and a crew that didn't come home. The Sapphire produced thrust figures, ranging from approximately 7,500 to over 11,000 pounds of force, depending on the variant. That put it in direct competition with the Rolls-Royce Avon, the engine that would go on to dominate British jet aviation for the next 2 decades. And here is the detail that makes aviation historians pause. In several documented comparisons during development and early service, the Sapphire demonstrated smoother acceleration characteristics and more stable behavior at high altitude than the early marks of the Avon. It wasn't universally superior, no engine ever is, but it was competitive. In specific areas, it was ahead. The engineers at Armstrong Siddeley knew this, the test pilots knew this, and the RAF knew this too. So which aircraft actually carried the Sapphire? The Hawker Hunter, one of the most beautiful jet fighters Britain ever produced, flew in early development marks with the Sapphire installed. The Hunter is remembered today as an icon, fast, elegant, extraordinarily purposeful, and for a significant period of its development, it was Sapphire-powered. Then there was the Gloucester Javelin. This is where the story gets serious. The Javelin was Britain's first delta-wing all-weather interceptor, a large, powerful, twin-engine machine built to find and destroy Soviet bombers in darkness, in cloud, in the worst conditions the North Sea could produce. It entered RAF service in 1956. It carried 2 Sapphire engines, and it served as the RAF's primary all-weather fighter through the final years of that decade. Every time a Javelin climbed through cloud on a night intercept, every time it positioned itself between Britain's coastline and whatever was approaching from the east, it was doing that on Sapphire power. And then there is the aircraft that stops most people when they hear it. The Handley Page Victor, one of Britain's 3 V-bombers, a core component of the nuclear deterrent, the aircraft that carried Britain's atomic weapons during the most dangerous years of the Cold War. In its early marks, the Victor flew on Sapphire engines. Let that settle for a moment. An engine that most people have never heard of carried Britain's nuclear deterrent through the stratosphere. That is not a footnote. That is not a minor historical detail. That is the full weight of what this engine actually was. And yet it vanished. So the question forming in your mind right now is the right one. If it was this capable, if it powered aircraft this significant, what went wrong? The answer involves an ocean crossing, an American manufacturer, and a reputation damaged by mistakes that were never British to begin with. Here is the part of the Sapphire's story that almost never gets told. And when you hear it, you will understand exactly how a great engine's reputation can be undermined by events entirely outside its control. By the early 1950s, the United States was watching British jet engine development with serious attention. The Americans had their own programs and their own ambitions, but they were practical enough to recognize when someone else had built something worth paying for. The Sapphire caught their eye. A license agreement was arranged. The American company Curtiss Wright would produce a version of the Sapphire for United States military use. That licensed version was designated the Wright J65. And on paper, it looked like a triumph for British engineering, an American manufacturer building British technology for American armed forces, validation at the highest possible level. The J65 went into several significant aircraft. The Republic F-84F Thunderstreak, the Grumman F-9F Cougar. These were real operational machines, not experimental prototypes. Aircraft that pilots flew in active squadrons. And then the problem started. The Wright J65 developed a reputation for unreliability, compressor stalls, inconsistent performance, issues that caused genuine concern within the United States Navy and Air Force. The engine that was supposed to represent the best of British engineering was becoming a source of serious frustration. Here is the critical detail. The problems were not in the British design. They were in the American manufacture. The precision tolerances, the material specifications, the assembly standards that Armstrong Siddeley applied in Coventry, those standards were not consistently replicated at the Curtiss Wright facilities. The engine that arrived in American service was not, in the ways that mattered most, the same engine that flew so reliably in British aircraft. But that distinction was largely invisible to the outside world. What travelled was a simpler story. The Sapphire-based engine was causing problems in American jets. That was the version that stuck. And mud, once it attaches to a name, is extraordinarily difficult to remove. Precision engineering is not a blueprint, it is a culture. You cannot transfer a culture by posting drawings across the Atlantic. The specific knowledge of how tightly to hold a tolerance, when to reject a component that is technically within specification but feels wrong to an experienced hand, that knowledge does not travel in a license agreement. The Americans built the J65 as well as they knew how, but they were not building it the way Armstrong Siddeley built the Sapphire, and the difference showed. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the rivalry with Rolls-Royce was intensifying. The Avon and the Sapphire were competing directly for RAF contracts. Both were capable engines. Both had serious programs behind them. But Rolls-Royce was not simply an engine manufacturer, it was an institution. It carried a name that meant something in government corridors, in a way that Armstrong Siddeley, for all its genuine excellence, simply could not match. Rolls-Royce had relationships, it had history, it had the kind of quiet, unspoken authority that translates into contracts when decisions are made behind closed doors. Pay close attention to this, because this is where the story stops being about engineering and starts being about power. The Sapphire won arguments in test cells. It performed, it delivered, but the Avon won arguments in offices. And in the 1950s, the offices were where the future was actually being decided. Any man who has spent serious time in any industry will recognize that pattern without needing it explained. The best product does not always win. The most connected product wins. The product with the right name, the right relationships, the right institutional weight behind it. Armstrong Siddeley was excellent, but excellence alone was never going to be sufficient. And somewhere in Whitehall, a conversation was already beginning that would decide the fate of the Sapphire permanently. A conversation about efficiency, rationalization, the future of Britain's defense industry. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like progress. It was the beginning of the end. By the mid-1950s, Britain was facing a reality that no amount of national pride could soften. The country had won the war, but winning had cost almost everything. The economy was under pressure. The empire was contracting. And the defense budget, the enormous commitment to maintain credible military force in the nuclear age, was becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Something had to give. The government's answer was rationalization, a word that sounds neutral, almost clinical, but inside the industries it touched, rationalization meant one thing with brutal clarity. Companies would be merged, programs would be cancelled, and the people deciding which companies survived were not engineers, they were administrators, civil servants, politicians with budgets to balance and committees to answer to. In 1958, the axe fell. A government-directed merger created Bristol Siddeley engines. Armstrong Siddeley Motors, the company that had built luxury cars and world-class jet engines from the same Coventry workshops, was absorbed. The name began to fade. Programs were reviewed. And the Sapphire, already losing ground in contract battles against the Avon, found itself without the institutional home that had created it. This was not a market decision. Let that be absolutely clear. The Sapphire was not cancelled because operators were complaining. It was not cancelled because the aircraft it powered were failing. The Gloucester Javelin was still in frontline RAF service. The Handley Page Victor was still flying. The engine was still doing its job with exactly the reliability it had always demonstrated. It was cancelled because a merger spreadsheet needed to make sense, because 2 engine lines cost more to support than 1, because someone in an office decided that consolidation mattered more than continuation. And here is what that decision actually destroyed. Not just an engine program, an entire engineering culture. The accumulated knowledge of how to build a 13-stage axial compressor to Armstrong Siddeley's specific standards. That knowledge lived in people in draftsmen, machinists, test engineers who had spent careers understanding precisely what this engine needed. When the program wound down, those people scattered, retired, moved on. And dispersed knowledge in precision engineering is knowledge that is effectively gone. Then came 1966. Rolls-Royce acquired Bristol Siddeley Engines. The company that had absorbed Armstrong Siddeley was itself absorbed. And with that second merger, The last institutional trace of Armstrong Siddeley as an independent engineering force ceased to exist. The rival won, not by building a better engine, not by winning a technical argument, by surviving a political process that its competitor did not. Before we reach the final part of this story, if this kind of history matters to you, this channel is exactly where you will keep finding it. The stories that never quite made the mainstream. The engineering, the politics, the real reasons things happened the way they did. Subscribe right now so you don't miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below telling me which aircraft from this era you remember most or which story you want heard next. If this video is giving you something worth thinking about, hit the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates history told honestly. It costs nothing and it keeps this conversation alive. Now, back to the Sapphire. Because there is one final layer to this story, the part that explains not just what happened to the engine, but what the Sapphire's disappearance actually teaches us about power, about memory, about the way the world decides what gets remembered and what gets quietly erased. And that part is the one that stays with you longest. Here is the lesson, and I want you to hear it clearly, because it is not the lesson most people expect from a story about a jet engine. The Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire was not forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it succeeded in the wrong places. It succeeded in test cells and at altitude and in the cockpits of pilots who trusted it with their lives, but it did not succeed in the corridors where decisions were made, and in the end, those corridors mattered more. That is not a cynical observation. It is simply an accurate one. Any man who has lived long enough, who has watched careers unfold, industries shift, companies rise and disappear, will recognize that pattern without needing it spelled out. Because you have seen it. Perhaps you have lived it. The colleague who was better at the job but never got the promotion. The product that was genuinely superior but lost the market to something with a more familiar name and stronger distribution. The idea that was right but came from the wrong person, in the wrong room at the wrong moment. Excellence is necessary. It is never sufficient on its own. The Sapphire teaches this with unusual clarity because the historical record is complete enough to follow. We can read the technical comparisons. We can trace the contract decisions. We can follow the merger documents. The full picture is available to anyone willing to look, and the full picture shows an engine that deserved a different outcome. But I want to push back against pure pessimism here, because the Sapphire's story is not only a story about loss. Consider what it actually achieved in the time it had. It powered the Gloucester Javelin through years of frontline RAF service, standing between Britain and whatever the Cold War might have sent across the North Sea. It carried the Handley Page, Victor part of Britain's nuclear deterrent through the stratosphere at a moment when that deterrent was not theoretical. It was the edge that was supposed to prevent a catastrophic war from beginning. The Sapphire was part of that edge. It crossed the Atlantic and, despite the manufacturing problems that damaged its reputation unfairly, it influenced American jet engine development in ways that left traces in subsequent designs. Licensed engineering always leaves something behind, even when the original name disappears. And it demonstrated conclusively that the engineering culture of Armstrong Siddeley in Coventry was capable of work that stood alongside anything Britain or America was producing in that era. That is not nothing. That is a very great deal. The men who built it knew what they had. The pilots who flew it knew what they had. And now you know what they had. History recovered is not the same as history never lost, but it is far better than history that stays buried. So here is what I want to leave you with. The next time you encounter a famous name, in engineering, in business, in any field, ask yourself what that name displaced. Ask what was absorbed, what was rationalized away, what was merged out of existence so that the famous name could stand alone. Ask what the corridor defeated that the test cell had already proven. You will not always find a sapphire, but you will find something, and finding it changes how you see power. It changes how you see the world. The Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire flew from 1952 to 1960. It powered nuclear bombers, frontline fighters, and all-weather interceptors. It was copied by the Americans, absorbed by a merger, and erased by an acquisition. It deserved better. And now you know it existed. That is where history begins to correct itself. Not in government documents, not in official records. Here, in conversations exactly like this one. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel right now. There are more stories like this one waiting. Leave a comment below telling me what this engine made you think of, or which forgotten machine from your lifetime deserves its own story. Your comment keeps this conversation alive. Hit the like button if this was worth your time. And if you know someone who appreciates real history, not the version that only remembers the winners, share this with them today. The Sapphire is no longer forgotten, not by you, and that is enough to start with.